Go ahead, Brenna. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Scott, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak about the district's Bison Grazing Initiative at Pleasant Valley. As he mentioned, my name is Brenna Ness, and I'm the Working Lands Ecologist for McHenry County Conservation District, which means that I monitor and manage the farmland owned by the district that's currently in agricultural production and leased out to different producers. And that leased land includes the Grassland site currently being grazed by bison at Pleasant Valley Conservation Area. So today I'll be sharing with you why and how we established the Bison Grazing Initiative and how our unique and valuable partnership with Rooter Bison supports that initiative and some of the impacts that we've observed of having bison on the landscape. All right, hold on a second here. There we go. First, McHenry County Conservation District is one of 5 counties in Illinois where residents have supported the creation of a conservation district, which was established in 1971 and exists to preserve, restore, and manage natural areas and open spaces in McHenry County, and to provide the public with opportunities for education and recreation. Today, I'm at Lost Valley Visitor Center in Glacial Park, and Glacial Park and the other land protected by the district are part of the traditional homelands of many indigenous groups, including the Ho-Chunk, Kickapoo, Lakota Dakota, Mascoutin, Miami, Peoria, Potawatomi, Sauk, and Meskwaki. And we celebrate these special places and seek to learn and honor the history of those who came before us, and strive to forge meaningful relationships with indigenous communities to deepen our collective connection to the land. The district has protected more than 25,800 acres in McHenry County, with more than 20% of those acres currently in agricultural production. I work with about 50 different producers who help create a balance between keeping the district's farmland productive and preserving or restoring its ecological health and function. Currently, about 4,500 acres are in row crop production, about 400 acres are in hay production, and about 300 acres are grazed. And the rest of the acres in the farm program are field borders, filter strips, and grass waterways that are managed as farm conservation areas. And the district installed 30-foot field borders and 65-foot filter strips on all of our farm fields. The goals of the district's farm program are to protect natural resources, build partnerships, to be equitable, promote alternative agriculture, and support young and beginning farmers. Agricultural uses serve as a beneficial partnership and land management strategy until the district can successfully restore the farmland. Our approach to farmland management is conservation-oriented and data-driven. Recently, we implemented new practices and programs aimed at regenerating ecological function of our farmland soils. And some of those include our first organic crop lease and a conservation ag lease, which offers a longer term and reduced rent for stricter standards for tillage, nutrient management, and cover crops to promote soil health. I'm actually really excited because in 2024, the district had over 1,500 acres growing winter cover crops. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. Those cover crops included winter wheat, oats, cereal rye, tillage radishes, clover, and multi-species mixes as well. And that's a huge leap for us in the last couple of years. We went from 300 acres in 2021 to 1,500 acres in 2024. We've also implemented pesticide use restrictions in our standard ag lease, which includes no dicamba use and no neonicotinoid pesticide treatments on soybean seeds. And we're working on expanding the use of rotational grazing as a grassland management tool using cattle, sheep, goats, and obviously bison. And so with each of these initiatives, they're the focus is really on building soil health and restoring the soil microbiome by integrating the principles of regenerative agriculture. So why do we care so much about soil health and using regenerative ag practices? Some people think maybe these are just the latest buzzwords or the current popular trends, but the reality is that farmland is part of an ecosystem, and these ecosystems are damaged. If you read the description of McHenry County in the 1872 plat maps, you'll find the sentence that says, "The prairie is rich and fertile, the soil being a rich black loam, in places several feet in depth and inexhaustible in fertility." I find that so interesting because these people had been farming this land for only 30 years, and they decided that the soil fertility was inexhaustible. Obviously, we figured out eventually that that wasn't true. So, now we're trying to repair the damage that's been done to the soils and to the landscape. And so for the district, that means restoring prairie, woodland, and wetland ecosystems that have been lost, removing drain tiles where feasible, remeandering streams that have been strained, and rehabilitating our farmland. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the district's established partnership with a private producer to utilize a native grazer as a grassland management tool at Pleasant Valley Conservation Area to benefit grassland birds and other wildlife. And the project seeks to assess the impact of bison grazing activities on wildlife populations, habitat quality, and soil health, while also supporting the agricultural goals of the producer. Pleasant Valley Conservation Area is the district's second largest macro site, totaling over 2,000 acres and spanning nearly 3 miles. Obviously, the Kishwaukee River flows through the middle of the conservation area, and that conservation area is the largest land complex in McHenry County with no bisecting roads. It features oak savannas, tall grass prairie, and a diversity of wetland ecosystems. And now it features a herd of buffalo, which is very exciting to us for a number of reasons. But before I get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about the history of bison in Illinois and North America. It's estimated that prior to European settlement in the early 1800s, 60 million bison roamed the plains from Mexico to central Canada. And the last bison documented in Illinois was in 1808. So throughout the 1800s, bison populations began to drastically decline across the U.S. due to drought and disease, habitat loss, overhunting, and intentional removal. Bison were removed from the landscape to reduce railroad collisions and stalls, to make way for the American cattle industry, and to eliminate an important resource for Native Americans. The U.S. government recognized that bison were life-sustaining and a spiritual connection for many indigenous tribes across North America. And in the 1800s, policies were enacted to remove bison from the landscape in order to force Native Americans onto reservations. And so by 1889, bison were nearly extinct, totaling fewer than 1,000 individuals. And in 1894, Yellowstone National Park hosted the only known wild herd in the U.S. This quote from Aldo Leopold says, "What 1,000 acres of silphiums looked like when they tickled the bellies of the buffalo is a question never again to be answered and perhaps not even asked." And I'm thankful that Leopold was wrong about that, because we've really come a long way since the last bison was documented in Illinois. At the end of the 19th century, public and private conservation efforts were initiated to protect bison from extinction, both by saving the species and by protecting grazing land. And as a result, the number of bison on public lands began to increase, and private ranchers began to raise bison as well. And so the commercial bison industry is a relatively new business sector that began really gaining ground in the late 1960s. And in the US, the ranch bison industry is a multifaceted business that includes meat production, agritourism, byproduct sales, and conservation of this species and the habitat that they rely on. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Agriculture produced the very first report on the ranch bison industry. And at that time, there were 32 bison operations in Illinois. And those 32 ranches were raising about 700 bison. So that doesn't include the herds on public lands like Nachusa Grasslands or Medeawin National Tallgrass Prairie or any other sites. Today, it's estimated that there are more than 500,000 bison living on private land and commercial operations in the US and Canada, with an additional 30,000 on public land and 20,000 on tribal lands. And in 2016, the bison was officially designated the national mammal of the United States. In 2017, the National Bison Association announced a campaign to grow the bison population in North America to 1 million in the next 10 years. So bison have made quite an impressive comeback. It's been over 200 years since bison were extirpated from Illinois. And we obviously know that they have returned, but really on just a fraction of the acreage that they once grazed. So we think it's a pretty big deal that the district is working with Rooter Bison to expand the acres that bison are grazing in Illinois. And it's also a very unique thing to be in Illinois, to be leasing public land to a private rancher raising bison. Considering the mission of the district and the goals of the farm program, it makes sense that we would want to integrate bison into our grassland management strategy. Prairies evolved with bison and strongly influenced the productivity and biodiversity of these ecosystems. For 100,000 years, bison survived and thrived in North America, where they played a keystone role in the ecology of prairies and grasslands. And so they provide many benefits to and are an excellent management tool for these ecosystems. So when they're managed properly, grazing bison can enhance soil health and fertility, improve carbon sequestration, and protect grassland habitat. The grazing patterns and preferences of bison create a mosaic of microhabitats that supports grassland birds, pollinators, and other wildlife. Bison are more selective in their foraging habits than cattle, tending to favor grasses over wildflowers or forbs. Studies have shown that their diet consists of 70 to 90% grasses. In prairie ecosystems without any disturbance, such as grazing or prescribed fire, grasses often tend to dominate the plant community, outcompeting forbs or flowering plants. And so by grazing primarily grasses, bison are encouraging the growth of forbs and promoting a more diverse plant community and a more balanced ecosystem. Grazing also creates more structural diversity in the vegetation or variation in the heights and densities, which is very attractive to many grassland birds. Wallowing behavior is a unique, wallowing is a unique behavior that also can promote biodiversity. That is when bison are rolling around on the ground in a dust bath, and the common explanation for the behavior is to relieve skin irritations, either from shedding their winter coat or from biting insects like flies. And as they're rolling around and scraping the ground with their hooves, they create these areas of exposed soil and soil disturbance. And that bare ground can provide opportunities for pioneer plants to germinate or create habitat for ground nesting insects to burrow into. Many experts also point to grazing livestock on pasture as an important climate change solution. Bison naturally aerate the soil and are recycling nutrients through urine and manure. And obviously that benefits soil health by increasing biodiversity, building organic matter, improving infiltration, which reduces runoff. And organic matter captures carbon in the soil, keeping it locked in the land rather than in the atmosphere, where it can contribute to climate change. So obviously we recognize the benefits of grazing, particularly by bison, but the reality is that there are a lot of logistical challenges that come with establishing this type of program. Integrating bison into the conservation district's strategy is something that we've been wanting to do for decades, but the project was always considered cost prohibitive and just there wasn't the right place to put something like this in. But the opportunity presented itself at Pleasant Valley when our tenant there, who had been leasing the land for row crops, hay, and cattle production, decided to retire, wasn't going to renew their lease. And so when we initially acquired these parcels in Orange about 15, 20 years ago, we leased them to the previous landowner, and they were intensively grazing cattle on about 265 acres, as well as growing hay and row crops on about 100 acres. And the agreements that were established at that time favored the producer. There was not really much consideration given to how we could utilize the land in a more ecologically beneficial way at that time. So when this opportunity presented itself, we started to think about how we could manage the grassland using rotational grazing or adaptive grazing rather than continuous grazing methods, and potentially maybe having bison. So because these parcels are separated into two distinct areas, we decided to bid them out separately. And in 2019, we began leasing the east pasture to a producer who has been rotationally grazing cattle and sheep on 200 acres at low stocking rates during the summer and fall. And that rotational grazing is going really well. That habitat looks really great. And then over here to the west is another about 200 acres where the farmstead is. There's buildings and barns there. And there was land in row crops, land being used for hay, and then some pasture, if you can call it that. And so that's where we envisioned establishing the bison herd. But rather than bid it out, we did put together a request for proposals that outlined our expectations for the partnership and asked any interested parties to submit a proposal that included details about their business model, their fencing plan, their preferred lease terms. And there was some flexibility in that RFP, but we also clearly outlined our goals for the partnership. At the top of our priorities was to utilize rotational grazing in order to enhance grassland bird habitat. We also put the onus of fence construction and maintenance on the producer, and we had expectations that the producer would participate in education programs with the district. We didn't restrict the proposals to bison only. They were open to cattle. But we were fortunate because a partner of ours, Liberty Prairie Foundation, was aware of a bison producer looking to expand their operation in this area, thanks to a program that they have, a farmland access initiative called the Northeast Illinois Farm Link, and that connects producers and landowners for farmland access. So that program still exists, but it's currently managed by a different nonprofit called the Land Connection, which works now on a statewide level and is called the Illinois Farm Link. So we did receive a handful of proposals, but only one proposal was to rotationally graze bison. And so after reviewing each of the proposals, our board unanimously supported Rooter Bison's proposal. Rooter Bison is a private family-owned operation raising bison to protect habitat for native wildlife and to be a locally sourced alternative to traditional meats. Their approach to raising bison is a part of what made them a really great partner for us. Their proposal included installation of new fencing, a plan to raise a herd of immature bison, and at a low stocking density that would be rotated but remain on site year round. So because they were offering to install the fencing, which is very expensive, they requested a 15-year lease, and that's a lot longer than our typical leases, but we were willing to offer that because of the heavy upfront investment that they were making to the property. So the rooters are completely responsible for the care and management of the herd, and they agreed to work with us to meet our ecological goals for the site and to partner with us to provide educational programs throughout the year. The site had an existing barbed wire fence from the previous cattle operation. Obviously, that was not sufficient for containing bison. So we, with the help of volunteers and a lot of district staff, removed that barbed wire fencing so that the new fencing could be installed easier. And once the barbed wire fence was removed, Rooter Bison installed new fencing as well as a corral system. And that new fence is a 5-foot tall, high tensile woven wire panels with 2 strands of electric wire on the inside of the fence. And that fence has successfully contained the bison for the past 3 years, while also allowing deer and foxes and rabbits and lots of other critters to move through as well. The initial fence construction encompassed 30 acres of cool season pasture and oak savanna that was divided into 2 paddocks, which is the solid yellow line that you see here. And so that's where the bison have been grazing for the past 3 years. But the field to the south is 89 acres, surrounded by that dotted yellow line. And that was restored to prairie in 2021. Once the corn was harvested from the field, we burned the stalks and broadcasted native seed that had been harvested from a mature prairie at Pleasant Valley, as well as seed that was purchased with an Illinois Habitat Fund grant from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And that grant also funded the purchase of a flail vac seed harvester that's allowed us to expand our seed harvesting and restoration efforts in the county. The restored prairie was burned this past spring and fenced this past fall. So the bison pasture has increased from 30 acres to 120 acres when we opened the gates for the bison in October of last year. All right. This video was taken the week after the gates were open. They did not cooperate with us by, letting us open the gate and watch them frolic into that new pasture. They were very timid and wanted to explore it when no one was around. Can't blame them. But I put up a trail camera and they are definitely enjoying having that additional 89 acres of pasture and seem to prefer hanging out back there in that native prairie. So although cattle had grazed at this site before, we really didn't know the extent or functionality of the existing water lines. And we obviously wanted to make sure that the rooters had reliable access to water and electricity. So those were some aspects of the project that did take some time and coordination. And, just with any grazing operation, it seems like the logistics of water and electricity are kind of the biggest challenges. We also worked with our planning department to create signage that was installed on the fence line and the property boundaries. There was a lot of concern about public safety. We worked with the rooters and district police to really understand how having bison on district land could create public safety issues and how we could best be prepared for those. So we learned about the bison behavior and what to expect from the herd. And we developed an incident response plan that's updated every year to make sure that our police and staff are prepared for how to respond to an incident. We also invited our neighbors of the site to visit and learn about what we were doing, just to be transparent and keep them informed, which I think helped build a sense of community there. And we have not had any incidents with the bison. Bison were first brought to Pleasant Valley in December of 2021 when the rooters brought 4 females and 2 males, and they were kept in the corral overnight just to let them acclimate to their new site. And then the next morning they were released into the pasture. They were a little hesitant to leave again because we had a bit of a crowd there to watch them. They don't like to do things while being watched. Who does? But they did eventually gain confidence to leave that corral and took off for a loop around the perimeter of the pasture to get the lay of the land. So the bison settled in pretty quickly, and it wasn't long before they established this pasture as their territory. They created a herd hierarchy as with one of the females as the matriarch, and she's leading the herd here in this video. The other bison will follow her lead and respond to the potential threats according to her direction, whether to run or stand your ground. And then also, as I scanned to the right in this video, you can see one of the wallows they've created, and that variation in the vertical plant structure as well, where they've grazed some of the grasses to a shorter height. This part of the pasture is sedge meadow, so it's wetter than the rest of it, but hasn't impacted anything. So before the bison arrived, we prepared a monitoring and a management plan. As I mentioned, the goal of this project is to integrate grazing into our grassland management strategy to improve habitat for grassland birds and, of course, other wildlife as well. But in order to assess changes to the habitat, we are conducting surveys of wildlife and vegetation communities. And we first inventoried the plant communities in the original 30-acre pasture, which has some oak savanna, some sedge meadow, and cool season grassland communities. And in our inventory of this area, we identified a total of 90 plant species, with 40% of those being native plants and 60% non-native. So over the past 3 years, we've been making efforts to improve that native species component of the pasture by overseeding with native grasses and forbs and working to reduce the invasive species. But the rooters are very passionate about creating a healthy source of meat with these bison, and so they don't like using chemicals, and so we are not spraying herbicide in the pasture. The 89-acre restored prairie to the south was inventoried at the end of the first growing season, and we identified 95 species, with 63% of those being native and 37% non-native. So basically the inverse of the pasture to the north. In addition to plant species inventories, we're monitoring changes in the vegetation structure through annual quadrat surveys to assess any changes in ground cover, as well as visual obstruction readings using a Robel pole to assess changes in vegetation height. So we have 4 years of the vegetation height data for the 30-acre pasture that the bison have been grazing. The 2021 data was taken before the bison were introduced. And so since the bison have been grazing, you can see the vegetation has become more variable in height. There's taller areas, there's still very short areas. And what we're seeing on the ground is confirming what the research shows, which is that bison prefer grazing grasses over forbs, and they are selective in their foraging habits. They unfortunately do not like to eat reed canary grass. We are looking forward to monitoring the effects of grazing on that restored prairie. Obviously, we took some initial vegetation measurements in that field this year without any grazing. And you can see this red bar on the right-hand side is the average height of that prairie right now, or last fall. So that's about 4.5 feet compared to an average of 1.5 feet in the grazed pasture. We're also, monitoring the wallows that they've created and how they're changing from year to year. This is the largest wallow they've created. They do seem to spend a lot of time here. What's interesting about this spot is that it used to be where the hay feeder was for the previous cattle operation. And so you can tell by looking at the soil when you're there that it's higher in organic matter. This is an aerial image of that area from, about 6 years ago, compared to 2023. And it's pretty amazing to see that difference from, that high density continuous cattle operation compared to that low density bison grazing. This is much smaller wallow where the soil appears a little more compacted. But I was excited to find evidence of ground nesting bee activity. So, anecdotally, we have seen a lot of examples of how bison have created a more dynamic ecosystem on a relatively small scale. We also inventoried all of the oaks in the savanna in the pasture, and we are monitoring those annually for any damage by the bison. They do like to rub against the trees, but they haven't caused any damage or decline in the health of the oaks. We do find these clumps of hair in the bark, which are really a unique and a valuable resource for birds. Bison hair is very soft and insulating, so it's used by birds, can be used by birds to line the inside of their nests and keep their eggs protected both from extreme heat or extreme cold. And there's also research out there that suggests that bison hair in a bird's nest could potentially help disguise the scent of the nest from any potential predators. Grassland bird surveys are conducted during May and June each year to monitor trends in the breeding bird densities at the site. And the past 3 years of surveys in the bison pasture have detected bobolinks, stick thistle, eastern meadowlark, and savanna sparrows utilizing the site. And these are all species of greatest conservation need in Illinois, and most of them have declining populations within their range. So I'm going to focus on bobolinks for a little bit here. For the past 8 years, bird surveys have been conducted in the hayfield to the west. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but these 3 points, this is a hayfield that's dominated by cool season grasses. It's been hayed for decades, but it can only be hayed once per year between August 1st and September 15th. And so based on our survey data, we know that this is an important breeding habitat for bobolinks. This graph shows the bird densities in that hayfield from those 3 points. And so just as some context, the bobolink densities are about just under 1.8 birds per acre. So last year meaning 2023, and then again in 2024, we observed the highest densities of bobolinks in the pasture than we've seen at any district site. And very few bobolinks in the restored prairie where the bison have not yet grazed. So you can see dick thistle densities are also quite high, but it appears that what the bison are doing, I mean, these bobolinks were not here before the bison were here. The vegetation structure they've created, potentially the increase in insect food availability in their manure seems to be attracting bobolinks for sure and other grassland birds to the site. This is a really low quality picture from early June of one of many bobolink flitting around the bison pasture, and a picture of a bison patty with the big juicy grub laying on top. So lots of food out there. As a comparison, the bobolink densities in the cattle pasture are also pretty high. They're about 1.4 birds per acre compared to other sites. This is good. But obviously in the bison pasture, they're 3 times higher. And that's true for the dick thistle densities as well. So that's pretty exciting. Obviously, we're in year 4 of this project. And so as we move forward, it'll be really interesting to see how, these grazing activities influence the plant and wildlife communities in the pasture. We also conducted soil tests in 2021 and 2023, and these tables compare changes in the soil respiration, the organic matter percent, and the Haney soil health score. So soil respiration is an indicator of biological activity in the soil, and readings can fall from almost 0 to 1,000 parts per million of CO2. Most agricultural soils are considered degraded and don't read above 200. soils in this region typically have organic matter contents from 2 to 6%, depending on management or topography. And the Haney Soil Health Score is based on the soil respiration, the organic carbon, and the organic nitrogen levels. And that number can range from 0 to 50, but most soils don't score higher than 30. So these 2 points here are inside where the bison have been grazing since 2021. And this point on the east side is in the restored prairie that's only been grazed since October. But these tests were done before bison were out there, obviously. And so the results for that point on the east side I find very interesting because they demonstrate the change in biological activity from restoration of a row crop field to a prairie after only 2 growing seasons. You can see the soil respiration multiplied by a factor of 5. The organic matter percent doubled, and the soil health score tripled. So that's some of the other exciting data I like to nerd out about. All right. So that's it for me. I do like to thank our staff and volunteers who've all played a very important role in managing bison at Pleasant Valley, and our partner organizations as well. And I'm happy to take some questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brenna. This is the second time I've seen your presentation, and I was kind of on the edge of my seat the whole time. So you really have done a wonderful job putting this together. You provide just tremendous information, and you weave it together in a very engaging narrative form. So great job with your presentation.